So thank you for the introduction. So as you mentioned, I'm the Director of Quality at Siebens, which is kind of a funny thing. When I started this presentation and started working on this about 4 or 5 months ago, I was actually a dev lead and senior SDET on a team at a company called Vertafore. So this has been quite the experience for me, kind of moving through roles and seeing how, and it's actually changed the presentation over the last several months in terms of what does it mean to influence change individually, but also in terms of organizations. So I have a background in testing. I've done a little bit of everything, worked in mobile at Amazon, done web testing at several companies, worked on the core Windows OS at Microsoft, and even done video game testing. And anyone here done video game testing? Takes a specific kind of insanity. Yes, for those of you that haven't done it. But the big thing for me, and it has to do with my background, I actually started with a background in psychology, Masters of Divinity, before I got into software testing through video game testing. And throughout my career, whether I've been an individual contributor or been working more in kind of the management role, I've always cared about how do we make things better for people in teams. And to do that, that requires making changes in whether it's organizationally or just individually. So why influence change? I want to do a quick raise of hands here. So how many of the people here are on the dark side like I moved to, where you are a manager, director, VP, or something like that? Raise your hand. Okay, avoid those people, trust me. And so I'm glad to see, because like I said, when I started this, I was looking much from the individual contributor side of what does change mean? Because so often, the question that I've been asked, whether I've been an IC or a manager, is, isn't that something managers do, right? Isn't change and changing organizations, changing what's going on, processes, frameworks, whatever else, at the end of the day, doesn't this come down to a manager making a decision and making a change? The answer really is no. The best changes that I have seen my first 8 weeks at Siebens and even other places have come from people, the people doing the work, getting in and influencing that change. So why? Why would we want to do it? Well, we'll start out selfishly. First and foremost, for your career. So for those of you, maybe some of you have asked this question before, been the person to say, hey, isn't this something that managers do, right? I've never seen anyone in their career not be able to grow and to change and to have a positive impact, both in terms of breadth, or if you're just saying, I just want to move up. I want to get to that next level where when they understand how to influence change, that they can't do that and move forward. At Amazon, we talked a lot about our biggest concerns for people, and our biggest differentiator was, one, understanding scaling. That was a big thing. But the second thing that I saw was also understanding how to impact organizationally. So you want to grow in your career? Great way to do that is to learn how to influence change. Second one is for your team or your company, right? A lot of us want a better workplace. The last session was talking about Scrum and the impact of that and how the different teams were for those of you that were in here. And throughout all of that, I kept sitting there thinking, hey, a lot of this comes from the individual teams. Once again, impacting change within their teams. People saying, I want to have this process. I want to make things better. I want to change things going forward because it improves my life, it improves my team's life and my company. And the third one is we usually don't think very broadly. I know for me, a lot of times when I was early in my career, I'd look and say, I need to write a framework, or I need a tool, I need a piece of automation. But there was this little thing called Selenium that had started before, I think even before I'd started into QA, but watched it grow again and again and again, right? And you can see once again how impacting, and there had to be influencing and everything else with that. At that point, the company, I'm actually going to mention them in a minute, they were using a framework called Sahi. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but I never hear anyone talk about Sahi. But I hear everyone talk about Selenium, right? And when you can influence change and impact it in a great way, you can impact the entirety of the test discipline. So this is not going to be a, here's the 5 points of how you impact and you influence. I like what our first speaker said today of everyone should be taking what they're hearing and filtering it and understanding what to apply. I'm going to walk through some kind of checkpoints that you might want to ask yourself about, where if you say, man, I struggle to influence change, or I'm hitting roadblocks in my organization, these are some good things that I think of. And I walk through, but by no means are they exhaustive, and don't think of them as just a linear list, but there are principles that you can use to be able to impact change. So the first one is know your audience. So I think people learn more from stories of failure. Since I'm up here, I get to tell my stories of failure. So my second testing job, I should say, was at a company called Mantis Technology Group. We were doing automation, had started moving into that realm. I think I'd been testing for about 4 or 5 months, and I heard about this wonderful thing called automation. I really didn't know what it was, but I had heard that we had in our product, we had wanted to interact with a native Windows dialog from Internet Explorer, and our automation framework couldn't handle it. So I saw that as a challenge. I want to learn, I want to understand. Automation means I don't have to do my job. I can just sit and watch this stuff run. And so I looked at that and said, I can figure this out. I found a framework and I understood it and I showed my boss. And then he was like, yeah, that's great. You should talk to our team. And I'm like, yeah. So I get to the team meeting and I say, I have this great framework. It's perfect. Everyone should use it. And that's when the questions started. Well, how does this framework's language compare to what we're using currently? Well, I didn't know what language we were using currently, so I couldn't really give a comparison. Well, so you accomplished this task, but how do we write normal web automation? Like, you managed to automate this dialogue and you kind of showed how you could do some of this, right? But Levi, how do you handle the normal web automation? Well, I don't really understand. Well, how does it compare to our current web automation framework? Well, I don't really know what that is. And what I had done is I had rushed immediately to a solution without asking about my audience. I had said, I can solve this problem. I had the passion to solve the problem. I had the desire to solve the problem. I had a very encouraging boss, and to be clear, my team could have been way harder on me. They were very encouraging. They were very much asking good questions to try and say, hey, how does this fit in? Because they wanted to understand. But I rushed to a solution before I said, what is it that we're really trying to solve? Is there another way to do this? And so to me, it really comes down to asking the question of who's the idea for. In this case, I had an idea. It was a good idea. It was part of something we leveraged later on once we really refined it, but I hadn't asked who it's for. Well, it's just for me, right, on my own desktop system. No, it was for more than just me. It was for my team. The second part of this, and this is something that people sometimes missed, is that ideas often get contextualized. So once again, I'll pull from this morning from what our keynote speaker mentioned about we all have filters, right? We all have a way that we understand the communications from others. And so to be able to put it in a way that makes sense to someone else, to your audience, that helps. So the first example, I was talking about the framework. For those of you who are maybe not familiar, there's a framework called AutoIt. It's based off of a Python kind of basic hybrid language. So if I had understood that at that point, I could have talked to our team, because I think our team was writing automation in C#, and I could have said, hey, here's how it's, let me contextualize it. This is what this is, here how it compares, and talk very clearly about that, right? And this is, to be clear, if we don't contextualize, people don't necessarily hear what we're saying. They don't always understand what we're saying, so it's important to understand them. And some of this you might hear for anyone that does Agile, Agile or Scrum, or has a formal role for like product owner, or has worked in that role before. Identifying customer characteristics, right? It's key for us understanding what our customers want, what they desire, and how we communicate with them. How do we contextualize the information we're sharing? And the same thing applies. You may say, well, I'm just, I'm an SDET or I'm a QA, right? I may have to think about customers externally, but we have customers internally too. We have people that we work with. If we want to influence them, they want to be understood and communicated to well. Identify stakeholders and power brokers. So not only do you get one story of failure on this slide, you get two. So the second one, as I mentioned earlier, I spent some time at Amazon. I worked on their mobile shopping team. So if you've used the mobile shopping app where you buy goods through, that's what I worked on iOS, Android, Kindle, BlackBerry, on and on and on. And when I started on that team, it was actually before, for any of you that are familiar with the mobile space, there's a framework called Appium. That's a Selenium driver for mobile automation. And this was pre-Appium. So we were trying to figure out, how do we do automation? What do we do? What's an effective way of automating? And we really realized as we went along, and then we adopted Appium and continued to drive, we didn't have a reliable way of executing our tests in kind of a remote execution environment. So at Microsoft, I had obviously, an environment where when I wanted to run my automation and I wanted to build, I said, go run this. It sets up the build, deploys it, tests it, tears down the machine, and go from there. But for mobile, we didn't really have that. So I said, great, I want to start building this. So I spent time to and from work. For those of you that are familiar with the Seattle area, or just with Seattle in general, how bad our traffic is, I had plenty of time on the bus to sit and build a prototype and just and then when I'm in the office, talk to people and say, what would you want? How would you want this to work? And built up an entire prototype for how do we deploy software and execute tests and everything else. Got it all working, showed it to my boss. Boss went great, coworker said awesome, went to our director and started having a conversation about it. I was all excited and he started asking questions. And being a good engineer, every time he'd ask a question, I would respond with, well, it works this way, right? Well, what about X thing? Well, we just do this. Well, what about this? Well, you just do this. And we went from discussing to debating to arguing to me being told, stop what you're doing, don't work on it anymore, you're done. You're putting your project aside, we're using a different project. And I was obviously frustrated. And what had happened is I hadn't realized that there was someone that I needed buy-in from that could come and say, you have something that's fully functioning, you need to stop. Now, I don't blame the director in that scenario because, as I said, I acted very much like an engineer. Here's a question, here's an answer, right? You asked a question, I'm going to tell you what the answer is. What I didn't pull at was his concerns. I didn't contextualize well. I didn't understand what his power and his role was. I didn't ask good questions of him when he asked me questions to try and clarify what was communicated. Now, I got a second shot at that. About 6 months, a year later, we had a new director, went through a similar process again, but this time I listened, this time I talked better, and the project was a success. It went on to become a development team and be used internally. It was great. But I learned a key lesson here that you gotta understand, who's your stakeholder? Who controls the power? Who are those people that raise their hand? Last but not least, I had to throw this in here. It's a pet peeve of mine. When you have these conversations, when you have these decisions that are made, document. You will thank yourself later when you can come back and say why a decision was made. What were the customer characteristics and those sorts of things. So document. So second, have vision. I'm sure none of you have ever seen anything like this before. This is a vision statement that I made up. And to be clear, to me is usually what I think of when I think of vision. Our company's vision is to create synergistic opportunities by maximizing the verticals and horizontal integrations across the insert here industry. And if this matches yours, I promise I didn't steal it off your website, but it does make me a little sad. This is not what I'm talking about, but it is always what I think of when I hear have vision. It is some sort of platitude or something that you might hear at a director or a VP or a C-level exec level, right? Of what does it mean to have vision. But to me, vision is understanding what change looks like, okay? It's understanding what change looks like. It's not something that is steeped in complex language. It is having a purpose and a goal for where you're going. And that's the second part of this. A lot of times you'll have high-level sort of statements. I want to build a remote execution framework. Okay, well, but what does that look like? Where is this driving us to? Why are we doing that? I think for Amazon, when I'd have the conversations around this, it was something along the lines of we want to build a remote execution framework to better enable automated testing for developers, for our manual testers, and for our automation engineers, right? So that we can have real robust testing and not have failures. Because what started this was everyone would plug devices under their desk, run some automation. Oh, it didn't work for me. Hey, Levi, can you come take a look at this? Or someone else on the team. I like writing automation, not trying to figure out what's wrong with your USB port, right? But that turned into a vision of, okay, what's the impact? What are we doing and what's the direction of the change we want to make? And another key of this is understanding why it's critical, right? Well, why is it critical for us to have a remote execution framework to run mobile automation? Well, right now, people aren't running our automation. They're just ignoring it. Developers won't run it because there's no easy way to do it. The manual QAs that we had at that time didn't have the familiarity with some of the tools to be able to set it up. It was very time consuming to set up, right? So we had to understand, why was it critical that we want to make this change? And part of the reason for doing this is you can always come back and to check, what was your goal and why are we doing this, right? It gives us something to check against. I can tell you from the management side, I love this fact, because if someone comes to me with an idea and says, the one we're going through right now is, I want to change our test casing system from what we have to something new. And okay, great. What's your reason for doing this, right? Because maybe the system, one of the complaints we've had at our company is our system is slow. Well, great. Our vision is not to get a new one necessarily, it is to get a system that is performant. We can check against that. That also may mean increasing the RAM and the CPU and getting an SSD for the machine that we're having it run on, right? Or maybe moving it off of a VM onto a physical box, right? So it gives us something to come back to and to drive against. So you work on the vision, you refine it, right? You come up with something clear that you can understand. And like I said at the beginning, I said, these kind of look like steps. Like, well, I could start with knowing my audience and I can get my vision down and go from there. Your vision should come through conversations with others. Your vision, put it as your idea, right? It should come through communicating and talking to others. Not necessarily in being with big meetings like this, but even just individual. So, but when you start communicating, back to like the stakeholder example I gave, you need to make sure that you're communicating well and that you're communicating clearly. And the one thing that I always start with, this is whether I'm sitting down with someone one-on-one, I'm talking to a group, is start with answering the question of why. Why do I care? Why should I want to make this change? Because anytime I'm talking to someone, especially if I'm trying to convince them to make a change, guess what? They know it's probably going to cost them something. It is very rare when there is a change that needs to be made where I'm not going to say, that process we've been doing for the last 5 years that, I don't necessarily think is the most efficient one. Yeah, we're going to need to change that. You're going to be more uncomfortable with this new process. It's going to take some time to learn. Remember how we've been doing waterfall for the last decade at this company? Well, we want to try this new thing called Scrum. Well, I know it's not new, but new to us, right? And that's going to cause change, and it's going to make things better. And here's why. Here's why we want to make the change. The second thing is, with this, once you can clearly articulate the why, it's handling questions well. So I mentioned that director that I was talking to that blocked my project. I did not handle questions well. I got asked questions, and what I did is I responded with the first thing that was in my head. I jokingly say I was being a quote-unquote good engineer, because I'm sure all of us know engineers that when we ask a question, their answers sometimes feel perhaps a little combative, a little bit like they're defending something as opposed to having a conversation. That's exactly what I did. But there's other aspects to this too, because there are times where you will have questions where the questioner is asking you something that is combative. I've had this happen in my career previously, where I've been in meetings and people have come at me with questions because they have an agenda, they have an axe to grind, they have, maybe I took the last donut in the box, or they just don't agree with my decision. It doesn't necessarily matter what it is. But how I handle that question will impact my credibility and my ability to communicate well with that person and other people that are present. So I have a trick sometimes. I try and remember this, but when someone asks me a question, especially if I feel like, man, it's getting personal for that person, what question can I ask back to them? So if they ask me about, why should we use this new framework that you built? It seems like it doesn't do X, Y, Z. We shouldn't use it. I say, okay, great. What's your concerns about those things? Why do we need those things? And to continue the conversation. More often than not, even if they're frustrated, even if your project is maybe going to replace their project, if you can start it as a conversation, it'll move things forward, and that's the key. And if not, the nice thing is, if you're asking questions, you won't end up in the state that I was, which is, with that director, I burned my credibility, to be clear, because I didn't listen, I didn't handle the questions well, and I didn't communicate well. Third, you want to keep the vision at the center. And so what this is Every time, if you guys have ever been in a meeting where you're refining your test casing processes, or we're getting a new test case management system or a new automation framework, halfway through that, you'll find people start jumping off to other things, other topics. Well, what about this? Well, we need to fix our unit testing problem first, right? When you're communicating, keep the vision at the center. You got to draw people back. You got to draw people back to what is it that we're trying to accomplish. And that's why having vision, call it an idea, call it a concept, and keeping that at the center is critical. If you don't have that, it's really, really hard to continue to have a coherent conversation without running kind of everywhere. So, communicating well, key. Keep these things in mind. So after you've done that, you started communicating, and once again, not a formal process, but even if you start having conversations with people, you'll start to understand and identify contributors. Now some of you may say, well, I'm building a framework. I'll just do it on my own. You could point to my example. Well, I built everything on the bus, right, to and from work. And the key thing I should mention in that is I built a prototype of what we ended up doing. We threw away the entire prototype, right? It was good for some architectural research, but we built a development team because there's not much when you want to influence change that you can do individually and have a broad impact. There is change you can impact individually, but inevitably for a lot of things you will need help. You will need others to come alongside. So, a few questions to ask. First, who has the most to gain through this change, right? The people so I'll use the example of what we're going through right now. My company, we're evaluating a test case management system. When I was looking at it, I'm like, I won, even though I'm the director, I have every right to come in and say I'm making the decision. I have my pet framework that I want to use, and to be clear, so far at my company, every time I've had a pet framework or something that I've wanted, it's actually not been the decision we've made. And part of the reason is for this, because I'll come back to this and I'll say, I want people to participate. I want them to make the decision. Now, it doesn't mean we've made bad decisions, but I want them to have impact and influence here, because that will get them buy-in as well, because they'll feel like they won't feel like they're the ones making the change. So we had a couple evaluations. I set them up. I said, hey guys, go play with it. I want to hear back in a week. Let's chat, right? And so that got that participatory model going, because I could easily say, who has the most to gain? The guy that's complained about the speed of the system definitely does. The team that doesn't have test cases in there because it's too hard to do, they have something to gain. The second thing is that when you're talking about these concepts, and once again, if vision doesn't do it for you, say idea, concept, right? Who asks good questions? This is one I hadn't normally thought about, but we were doing a framework change at Vertafore in my last company. And I realized that the people that were asking the most productive questions didn't necessarily have a stake in it, but they cared about the concept and the ideas, and they wanted to participate, even though for them it was just kind of something that would help them. It wasn't something that they necessarily needed. It wasn't essential. It would be a small benefit. So if people ask good questions, right, talk to those people. They may want to participate too. And the third thing is who do you want to drive the vision forward, right? Who do you want to be your change agent? So I mentioned those people who raise their hand that are on the dark side. You want those people that raise their hand to help you drive the vision forward. You want the people that are the stakeholders, because they have influence as well. And it's not about, I should be very clear on this, influence, and I think I put this in the paper, is influence and looking at it as a form of, some people will say, well, isn't this all just manipulation or social engineering or whatever else? Sure, if you go in with the intent of, I want something only for me that is not a benefit to others, where I don't care about others, where I don't want to drive it forward to help others, right? Where it's just about me, sure, absolutely. However, I can tell you for sure, these people, they'll tell you no. People can smell that coming from a mile away. They will, or see it coming from a mile away, I should say. They understand and they see when people are trying to manipulate. But if you go in and you say, this helps our company, this helps our team, this helps me, right? You can be upfront about it. This helps me. Those people will come alongside and will want to drive with you. Now, last, before we talk about what happens with success and failure, fostering trust. I almost started the whole presentation with this slide. I could have had this be the only slide pretty much, done it in 3 minutes and said, do this. Well, if you don't do this, then everything else won't work, okay? You cannot influence without trust. That goes just to my last comment. If you're trying to be manipulative, if you're not looking out what's best interest for others, you will run into roadblocks. But here's the thing. This isn't, a lot of people look at this as I have an idea, I want to go make a change, now I'll start building trust. Okay? I'm ready to go make a change. I built a remote execution framework, I'm ready to go get people to adopt it. No, that's not how it works. If every day you aren't looking for how can I engage well with my coworkers, if every day I'm not looking at how can I build trust with my managers, with the people, my peers, with other teams, you cannot influence. All of this stuff comes down to conversations, right? Talking to people, engaging with them well. And if I understand that I don't trust someone else because they have an agenda or something they want to drive, then I'm going to say, that's okay, you may have the best idea ever, but I'm good. Because if I don't trust you, I'm not going to want to move forward. The same sort of thing. If as I'm communicating, if as I'm talking, if I'm not communicating in a way that builds trust, that lets people understand that I am a trustworthy person, once again, you cannot influence. So build trust every day. So, let's say you go and you influence, and you say, yes, I am successful. It worked. What do I do? It can kind of be, I have had this situation before where it's kind of like, what do they say, the dog chasing the car, and when it catches the car, it doesn't know what to do. You get to that point and you go, wait, people said it would work. We're actually moving forward with this. And the remote execution one that I had at Amazon was kind of that. After a couple of years and stops and starts and frustrations, it was finally like, we have a dev team. What do we do now? And the very first thing is to continue to drive that forward, to continue to make sure things are moving forward, okay? If you are the one with the vision and you are in the role of doing that, awesome. If you've identified a contributor who said, I really want to drive this forward, you're like, I had the idea, I really just want to be a developer now and just do those things, but I'm going to let others drive it forward, make sure they understand to keep driving, keep pushing, because this is a very, very long process. And this is key. Change always happens slower than you think it should, okay? So I finally get the director to approve the framework, and I have my prototype, and I'm like, great, we're going to be able to start rolling this out across teams. And then they're like, let's talk about our architecture. Let's talk about the technologies. And we went from using, once again, it was at that point my favorite stack, to, well, Amazon has their own internal one, so let's just build it all again from the ground up, right? And we talked about it, we talked about the benefits and the trade-offs, and it was, at that point, I believe it was the right thing to do. So I took my project that I had, we lit that on fire, and we kept the concepts and the ideas, and then refined it, right? So the change happened way slower than it seemed like it should. But the flip side of this was, because I was at Amazon for about another 3 to 6 months after we really started driving the project and going forward. I saw my little baby go off and start growing. They brought in a manager to manage that team, and that manager took it, and the people on the team took it, and it was out to 6 teams, and then it was, there's going to be maybe 20 teams that are going to adopt this, right, and continue to do that. And it started with a concept I had. I did not cause all of that to happen. Once again, the people that worked on that project did that, came alongside, but it took a long time. It took years to be able to build that up, and that's okay. Third thing is, it will not follow the plan. And I found this quote when I was looking for stuff. I don't even remember why if I was just looking for a nice thing to put at the top of my paper, but this is from The Martian. It says, there's no plan survives first contact with implementation. And that is absolutely true. That is why, once again, a vision, a concept, an idea is so critical up front. Because you will think, okay, our steps are to do these 5 things, and then it just doesn't work out. It just doesn't go the way you wanted it to. But if you have that vision, if you have that concept, it doesn't matter. It's iterating, it's improving, and it's probably going to be better than what you thought it was going to be, right? But it allows you to be flexible when you do that. Now, I've talked some about failure earlier. Failure is probably the most common. and that's okay. Not just because we learn from it, but it actually is, I think, an important part of refining our concepts and our ideas. First, what I do is I run through a series of questions to understand why this didn't work. Why did I try and influence change and it didn't work out? The first question I ask is, did it fail because the idea needs to change? I have a lot of ideas. I was sitting in the talk this morning and taking some notes, and I'm looking organizationally right now or at things like reviews and how do we do leveling and everything else, and I'm jotting down some ideas based off of what was talked about in there, and I can tell you right now, my ramblings that I wrote down, I will probably never show them to anyone because I'm like, yeah, these are probably not great ideas yet. I'm brainstorming, right? There's times where your idea needs to change. It's just not, it needs refinement, and that's okay. It's just part of that ideation process, and that's why I like talking about these things as conversations, because you should never wait to present to a group before you have the conversation and say, hey, what do you think of my idea? How could I make it better? The second one is you need to ask who or what is blocking you from moving forward. Because maybe you say the idea is great, but maybe there's a person or a thing that's blocking us. And you should always ask, is there a way to solve the problem? If there is, try it again. Is it a framework or technologies we just need to shift? Is it a director that has told you, do not work on this anymore? That is not a problem that you can solve right now, right? That is not a problem you can just go around. But maybe there is, even in that, of a way to have a conversation or to engage to go from there. And if the problems can't be solved, ask yourself when they can be. Because sometimes it's a matter of waiting and just saying, hey, this isn't something we can do this sprint, this release, even this quarter. But maybe it's at the start of next year we'll tackle this problem. And the last one is the idea too large to accomplish at once? And this is a very common Scrum thing, right? You break out stories, you put your stories in your backlog, your stories are too large. Same thing can apply here. When I looked at building the remote execution framework for mobile, doing all of that at once took me having lots of little conversations and building over time, right? I had to iterate many, many parts before we came to a whole. And that's really what it takes sometimes, is how can we break this out? So if your concept is, we need to change quality at my company, I would suggest chunking that into more than just change everything, right? Chunk it down into littler things that you can iterate on and build momentum on. So I just want to end with this before questions. Like I said at the beginning, I'm passionate about people. That's what I care about. And to me, influencing change is all about that. Our processes, our technologies, our code, they are all important. But it all comes back to people. And design, and I had to add testing because they didn't put it in here, but design, testing, and programming are human activities. Forget that and all is lost. So if you keep that in mind, and if you really look at your people that you're influencing, really understand them, have a strong idea for what you want to influence and communicate well, that's how we really start to be able to influence change. Questions?
All right. Questions?
I talked everyone into silence. Yes.
When you're cultivating your team to actually ask some of the questions that you want them to help guide your projects, etc., how do you kind of farm that in a way from people that either don't feel like they have the power to affect change, or they don't feel like they have the trust existing within the group?
Okay, I have to think for a second since I'm on video camera. Yeah, it is. Oh yeah, so what was the question? So let me rephrase your question and then tell me if this is accurate. But basically it is, how do you encourage the people that, especially in my role, that work with you or under you to be change agents, to be able to feel like they can change when they may not feel like they have the power, the skill, or the abilities? Is that accurate? Cool. Yeah, it's a challenge. So especially when you come in, and for a lot of people, because a lot of times with questions like this, I've seen it's typically where you have either it's been organizationally that way, or you come into a new organization where it's, we've done it this way, or there's just people that it's not my job. To me, it's a couple of things. So one is you have to really drive people to be excited about I don't want to say about making change, but finding first, going back to the context thing, what are the things that they want to see change? What is it that they care about? What is it that they want to see do different? So I used the example of one of my employees that said, I really want a different test case management system, right? And talking and understanding with that and starting to build that there. The second shift, though, is once they have that, it's them understanding, and to me, it really does boil down to this. I'll reference the talk again this morning, of building a culture where people feel like, one, they're free to fail, and that they have the trust of the people around them. That doesn't in and of itself always deal with the it's not my job, because there's people that work, and we've all worked with people that have said, this is just not my job, I don't want to change, I don't want to do these things. But it starts to give that environment where people feel like it is okay to ask that, it's okay to suggest things. And especially when people, and I was listening to a TED talk about this, it's actually one that's on failure. There's the TED podcast, if you guys want to listen to it. It's very, very good. But they talked about how at Google, they actually have programs to encourage that sort of failure and actually create that to be like, you're free to fail, right? We want you to try to fail. We're actually going to reward you for failing, right? So when you start getting that, you create that environment, people start understanding that I can ask the questions, and I can want to push for change, and I can want to do change. And then you really need, the other part of this that has to go in the background, though, is if you are the leader, or if you have other leaders, whether they're managers or just senior people or even junior that just care about this, to influence as well, right? It's that culture sort of thing where you work together and you have those people say, you have every right to do this, you drive that as well. The last thing I will say is for those people that are really, really don't want to make it their change, and if they seem very in the selfish camp of, I don't want to do change because it's work, appeal to them by their self-interested nature of, great, this is part of your job. We expect you to be part of this and to do this. This is what will get you promoted. It will kickstart that process. So there is that's part of the whole appeal to own self-interest. Can be a good place to start for some people as well. That's very rambly. But if you want the long answer, grab me tomorrow.
Any other questions?
Cool.
Please.